Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you follow the news, which I hope most of you do, then you know that social division and problems are seemingly on the rise. Among them, homelessness, intolerance, and other social ills. But fortunately, our guest tonight, Andy Thayer, an advocate, longtime Chicago resident for LGBT rights, and an advocate for the homeless. So Andy, welcome to the show. Good to have you back. It's been a while.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Let's start with homelessness. Something that people don't think about a lot. I think most of us would prefer to just kind of sweep under the rug because it's not us, and those homeless people probably must have brought it on themselves anyway. So how is Chicago, or the Chicago area, dealing with this issue? There's been some unfortunate incidents lately.
Yeah, unfortunate to put it mildly. The city of Chicago under Rahm Emanuel and Uptown's alderman James Kappelman has launched a full-fledged assault on homeless people in Chicago, beginning with their sweep of some homeless encampments in the Uptown neighborhood on September 18th. For those who aren't familiar with what was going on, it made actually quite a bit of news last month. There was a couple of longtime homeless encampments in Uptown, which has traditionally been a portal for people coming in that are down on their luck or whatever and need some help. Lots of social services there, and so homeless folks would stay there as well. Especially since we've had a huge eviction problem as lots of affordable housing has been destroyed in the city and nationally. And the city of Chicago used a construction project underneath the Lakeshore Drive bridge viaducts to shoo people out of there. And we had known that this was coming, and those of us in Uptown 10 City Organizers, which is a local group there, organized to have an alternative place for people to pitch tents to go. And the city of Chicago blocked us at every turn on that. We ended up with the federal lawsuit against the city of Chicago now. And after people were booted out of the so-called tent cities by Lakeshore Drive, the city of Chicago launched a new initiative to shoo people out all over the city, including Uptown, not allowing people to pitch tents, not allowing people to have tarps. This right on the eve of winter. So this was a dramatic escalation from what the city had been doing previously, and they have given more fodder to this federal lawsuit that we've got against the city now.
Now, what I know you've talked to people in the city, and what are their expectations for where these homeless people will go? If they can't pitch a tent, they can't have a tarp, what does the city expect them to do?
That is a good and sensible question, Kevin, and the city has failed at every turn. Under their own admission, there are not enough shelter beds for people, temporary shelter, let alone the permanent housing that people need. The city has got one way of counting homelessness, which dramatically undercounts the number of people. The Chicago Coalition for the Homeless has got another count, which is endorsed by the Health and Human Services at the national level. And according to the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, there are 82,000 homeless in the city of Chicago.
That's a huge number.
Yes, yes. And according to the CPS, the Chicago Public Schools, some 18,000 of their students, enrolled students, were homeless during the 2016-2017 school year. That is according to one of the departments that Rahm controls. And yet you had all this press coverage about these 50 to 75 folks who are staying underneath the bridge viaducts because they were visible. And that's what annoyed Alderman Kappelman. That's what annoyed Mayor Emanuel, because it sent a message that the city of Chicago was not taking care of its own, that it was not providing the housing that people need, that they were showering wealthy private developers with millions of dollars in TIF funds, $15.8 million for a luxury high-rise right in the Uptown neighborhood, literally just 100 yards away from one of these tent cities. Other multi-million-dollar developments, office projects and so forth, funded with taxpayer money, scattered about the city. And if you are familiar at all with the city, you'll see all sorts of construction cranes going on around. Almost every single one of those are for wealthy residents to be, or for luxury office buildings at a time when we've got 82,000 homeless. And so the city didn't give an alternative place for people to go.
They just told them, you can't stay here.
You can't stay here. They said, well, I guess you can go down to Pacific Garden Mission, which is one of the worst of the shelters, and that's a long story. It's a very sectarian outfit that runs it. It's not friendly to LGBTs, for example, and people have to be kicked out early in the morning unless they consent to stay through religious services and so forth. And there literally is not enough shelter beds in the city during good weather, let alone the weather we're going to be getting the next few months.
Now, I also understand that not only have the homeless been scattered from these, essentially the community dwellings that they had created under the viaducts, but they can't camp out in any public space either. Is that
That's
correct?
right. That's the city's new position, that they cannot camp out any place. Now, they had previously enforced Parks Department regulations that you had to get out of the parks by 11 p.m. And so we had suggested that people stay on the public way, so long as they're not blocking other people from going about their business. And the viaducts were perfect for that, in that they provided a modicum of shelter, as well as there was enough room there. Now, under the new regime, the city is not only kicked those folks out of there, but once the viaducts are reconstructed, they're going to be reconstructed in such a way so that homeless people can't stay there. It's what's known in the architecture trade as defensive architecture. You purposely put bumps and park benches, or you don't have benches at all at bus stops. You purposely make any public space such that it is not comfortable for people to stay there for any length of time.
So let me ask you, going back to the Alderman Kappelman, do we know what kind of, he probably was getting, I would guess, was getting complaints from constituents saying, well, we don't like this, for whatever reason. If you're in an alderman's position and you've got constituents coming to you saying, well, you know, we think this is a problem, you, Mr. or Mrs. Alderman, have to take care of it, what are alternatives that the alderman might have done?
Well, first of all, the homeless folks staying under those viaducts are his constituents as well, as are plenty of other working class people in the ward who have been really hit by Alderman Kappelman's attacks on affordable housing in the ward. We have lost in Uptown over 1,000 units, over half of the units of SRO housing, single resident occupancy housing, on the north side of Chicago over just the last several years.
Through gentrification?
Through gentrification, Alderman Kappelman has allowed private developers to flip these residences. There's one that's in the process of being flipped right now, the Wilson Men's Club Hotel, that's going to result in 200 fewer units of affordable housing in the ward. This is a pattern that's been repeated over and over again. So people are being, his residents who've been there, his constituents who have been there for 10, 20, 30 years, unlike the newbies coming in, the gentrifiers, they're his constituents as well. And there are plenty of Lincoln Parks, there are plenty of Old Towns, there are plenty of other already gentrified neighborhoods for people to go to, but a lot of these newbie residents, they say, oh, this is cheap real estate, let me flip it, let me get a great investment. That's not so great for working class residents in the ward who don't have a lot of alternatives. We live in a country that is losing every single year 10,000 publicly funded units of housing each year, affordable housing. The CHA that Rahm Emanuel has presided over has seen a huge net loss in affordable housing. As we've seen the Robert Taylor homes go, as we've seen Cabrini Green go. That isn't to say that those developments were great, but it's because the CHA purposely did not keep
Maintain
them up.
them.
Yeah, and they're sitting on a $440 million budget surplus, one of the few overfunded pension plans in the entire state.
Which program is this that's overfunded?
The Chicago Housing Authority. And they're purposely not spending this money to refurbish the units it has. They're letting them deteriorate and say, oh, this is horrible housing for poor people. We've got to be nice to them. We've got to kick them out and refurbish it. And they never do the one-to-one replacement of affordable housing that they promise to do. They never tracked the people, for example, who used to stay at Cabrini Green. And now they're trying to take aim at Lathrop Homes, which was actually one of the nicest public housing developments built during the 1930s. It wasn't the sort of warehouse style that Daley Sr. put to enforce segregation. This was actually a very nice public housing development along the Chicago River.
So the homeless, as you know, one of the problems that the homeless face is that political organizing is difficult with any constituency.
Right.
But particularly amongst the homeless, because there's so few resources. There's no money to fund candidates. Many of them may not even be registered to vote. If they don't have a residence, it's harder to vote. So how do you bring political pressure to bear in a case like this, given that the constituency that's affected has so little power to begin with?
Well, and I think the thing to remember also, Kevin, is that people are dealing with trauma. You know, even if everything else is going well in their lives, and it frequently isn't, they are homeless. They are dealing with, I might freeze to death tonight. Where is my next meal going to come from? How can I maintain my job? A lot of homeless folks are working. I know someone who's working at Target who's homeless for many, many months. For example, there just is not enough income in a lot of these jobs to support rent, and this is a huge problem. So, how do people organize? Well, some homeless folks, despite the odds, do become spokespeople, and we've had them speaking out both for our organization and other organizations. But it is difficult. But people, part of what made the tent cities work is that they formed a form of collective safety for folks, that people would look out for other people's stuff, because people have to go off. They have to go off for doctor's appointments. They have to go off for jobs, and having a community of folks allowed people to keep track of each other's stuff. They'd look out for each other. And it was a form of safety. It also provided a place for social workers to come to get them services, for people who dropped off food or water or what have you. For our organization was dropping off tents so that people wouldn't freeze. So what the city of Chicago has done by dispersing people has put them at enormous risk, because people literally can't find them now with the services that might help them.
And they also have far less shelter. I mean, the viaducts gave them at least some shelter from snowfall, rain.
But the city has outlawed, basically, people pitching tents. And we're on the eve of winter again here.
So you listen to this, and I can't help but feel it's an intractable problem. But you can't, that's just despair. You can't say it's intractable.
And it isn't, Kevin. I mean, this is one of the things, is I got involved in this issue from a First Amendment standpoint, and it's a long story, I won't bore your listeners with it, but the more I studied the issue, you look up on Wikipedia, and according to Wikipedia, the longest running homeless advocacy organization in the United States was an outfit formed in 1981. It's actually inaccurate. There's the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless was formed in 1980. But what it does say is what a contemporary problem this is, because prior to the 1980s, there apparently wasn't enough of a problem for people to build organizations around it. And really, it wasn't. You have to go back to the 1930s, and what was essentially their homeless rights organizations back then, the so-called unemployment councils and so forth, that would, when the sheriff's department evicted people, groups of people would put all of the possessions back in the house and so forth. And this is what actually spurred that earlier wave of public housing, such as how we got Lathrop Homes in the first place. It was a public housing boom that was spurred by very different motivations than when Richie Daley did it to enforce segregation in the 1950s. And so that's precisely what I would argue that we need today, that we have had a huge net loss of affordable housing, and all the various schemes that the city has put forward are Band-Aids on a gaping wound. Things like, we're going to give into a public housing trust fund, or I should say an affordable housing trust fund. That's the latest one, which if you look closely at, it's very similar to the TIF scam, where you start a program under the guise of helping people, and it actually just becomes a mayoral slush fund with no accountability. Thank God for organizations like the Gap and so forth that look after these
Well,
sort
the
of
Cook County
things.
Clerk also tries to publicize
Tries.
tries very hard to publicize information, but that's about the best they can do.
But
Is to,
what we really need, I mean, things like Section 8 vouchers and so forth, they're good for the folks who get them, but don't get me wrong. But what we really need is a rebuilding of the public housing infrastructure in this country, because what has happened is often portrayed as it's just those people. Poor people, black people, homeless people,
crazy people,
whatever.
Yeah.
And that's the way they try and separate us off, when actually the destruction of public housing in this country has meant that everyone's rents have gone up, because there are many, many more people chasing fewer units of low-cost housing, which just, it's supply and demand. It
Sure.
pushes up the price. And so this is why both national parties have had a war on public housing. Whether you're talking Clinton or Obama, or of course the Bushes, and now of course
Donald Trump.
his name, I won't say it.
Yeah.
But there
Voldemort,
has been
right?
there has been a war on public housing in this country, in concert with the private real estate industry, because it's competition. It drives down rents in the open market if you got this swath of public housing that offers some level of competition.
So that brings up, excuse me, a generalized topic about competition and the free market. And you know, these are buzzwords that get tossed around in political circles all the time. But the free market is useful in many areas, but there are areas where the free market fails. And social services seems to be a prime example of that. I think healthcare is another one where the market forces don't.
You think these roads, these fine roads that I walked out here on, were fully supported by the few taxes that were given to them and so forth? There's huge subsidies for this
Yeah,
stuff.
there's huge subsidies.
No one talks about that.
And they're not maintained by private industry. There's no competition to go build this road and charge tolls to use it. These are all public thoroughfares, right? So do you see that this, the kind of, what word am I looking for? The philosophy of the country, which seems to be really focused in the last few decades on this, what I think is kind of a mythical explanation of free market supremacy.
Right.
Is that's
neoliberalism.
the neoliberalism,
yeah.
right? Part of it, I think of also the, not to disparage institutions, but the University of Chicago kind of thought about free markets. Seems to be, this is the destructive side of that. Is that how you read this
I mean,
as
look
well?
at our healthcare system. It is the most inefficient in the world. It is the most costly in the world. It's also the most privatized free market of any industrialized country, bar none. We spend a lot more money on it with less good outcomes for the vast majority of people. There are countries where the healthcare outcomes are far better. This is the same great free market that gave us the opioid crisis, where you get the private pharmaceutical firms pushing this stuff because it's highly profitable. People get hooked on it, and if they can't continue getting it, then they'll get heroin or whatever to keep that all going. But,
similar to the tobacco industry
there's
model.
this whole mantra. I mean, I dislike the term neoliberalism because it's so rarely defined, but it's basically this mantra that whatever the market says and allows is the realm of possibility of what's allowed. And it gets away from the whole notion of all the sorts of things that so many people in this country enjoy, things like the 40-hour work week, things like paid holidays and so forth, all these sort of things that were won by the labor movement in the 1930s in the context of a Great Depression, where if you just say, well, let the free market do it, well, 1/3 of people are unemployed, well, let them starve.
The free market brought us the Great Depression.
Yeah, and people fought against it. There were 3 general strikes in this country in 1934. There were massive sit-downs in all major industries beginning in 1936. And this is how these programs, such as Social Security and so forth, that we all enjoy today, were won. It wasn't through the free market. People forced these changes through their own actions. And at a time when we've got the jerk-in-chief, where people are, with some reason, despondent about how nutty our national politics have gotten, I think people need to look back at how these gains were won in the first place. It's by people rejecting both parties And that's what they did. They rejected both parties.
And organized on their
And
own.
organized in spite of the parties. And we were discussing a little bit earlier the whole situation, the Vietnam War, the Ken Burns documentary, and so forth. One of the most interesting things happened right here in our city. People talk about the '68 convention. But where that was really pivotal from a political standpoint was that the New Left had bought into, well, yeah, the Republicans, they're evil, they're awful, and so forth, and they were correct in that assessment. But the '68 convention led many to agree that the Democrats were part of the enemy as well, and that they couldn't work with them. These, Daley is busting heads to get his pro-war candidate to cross the finish line. People, for the most part, rejected both major parties. Now, Nixon squeaked into office, and yet we had probably the most liberal presidency in terms of actions actually undertaken of any post-World War II president.
Under Nixon himself.
Under Nixon himself. He was a racist, he was a sexist, he was a homophobe, he was a warmonger, he was an anti-Semite. You go right down the list. He was ideologically far more committed to everything bad than even Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is mostly concerned about his ego.
Right.
And not any particular ideological thing, but anything that promotes Donald is best. Whereas Nixon was a true Cold War war hawk, wanted to nuke North Vietnam, and yet...
And a very cunning and capable person as well.
Far more cunning and capable than the current occupant. And yet these movements, because they rejected both parties, and I can't stress that enough. If our movements are going to be useful, they can't be useful idiots of either party. I think it's a huge...
So how would that translate? So here's one of the questions, and I've been involved from time to time in the activist community as well. One of the questions is that things change because you achieve political power. And without those levers of political power, it's very hard to make things change. So that involves getting elected to somewhere somehow, or getting people you trust elected. So if
I would agree with the first part of that statement, not the second part.
Not the getting elected part?
Not the getting elected part.
So what's the alternative?
Did the power of the civil rights movement derive from their getting elected to office when most of them couldn't even vote?
No, actually it didn't.
The power of the '63 March on Washington was a power that rejected not only the Republicans, but the Democrats as well. I mean, the little-known story, JFK tried to get that march shut down. He pleaded, he begged, and basically, to their eternal credit, Dr. King, Bayard Rustin et al. Said, no, this march is going forward. You either get with a program or it's going to be a march against the White House. And that's the true story about why that march was so powerful, because it was a non-elected power. It was a power in the streets. It was a power that had been built in the civil rights movement in the Deep South by mainly black folks themselves. And they forced a presidential administration to do things that, if they'd been left to their own devices for all the hagiography about LBJ and so forth, I don't think would have happened.
So do you think that power is still usable today? I mean, I think back to where you and I first met, protesting against the invasion of Iraq under George W. Bush. And it was the largest worldwide protest in history. And it made no difference in Bush's actions. So do you think that this kind of power that we're talking about is still effective today?
Well, one protest does not a movement make. And as we saw, a big problem with that movement was that a lot of people were only against George Bush's wars and not against the bipartisan war. And I think, unfortunately, that movement was very cleverly siphoned into Barack Obama's first campaign, and there it died in terms of the anti-war movement. All the sort of things that George Bush had been doing that people were screaming and shouting about was okay when a Democrat did it. And this is why I insist on the issue of political independence. There's been huge demonstrations during the 1980s against nuclear weapons and so forth, because they were useful idiots of the Democratic Party. They were easily diverted and co-opted. I mean, just because you get a lot of people out there on the mall trampling down the grass doesn't make a movement. It has to be the sort of movement that demands things of both parties, that is strictly nonpartisan. I mean, Dr. King never endorsed a political candidate in his lifetime. He basically played the two parties off against each other, and that was the power. And the anti-war movement post-1968 Democratic National Convention had also implicitly rejected both parties, and that gave the movement its power going into the early 70s and all these reforms we talked about. Clean Air, Clean Water Act, a Supreme Court decision in favor of abortion rights, LGBT movement that was burgeoning and allow people like me to sit here and talk with you and have a nice conversation as an open LGBT person. I mean, these sort of things were built out of independent movements. And that's what the history we have to get back to. It's not just having a big demonstration is not enough. If it's just in the service of one or the other political party, it's a dead end.
So what constitutes a movement? I mean, certainly protests are a part of it, and getting press coverage, exposing the actual effects of whatever it is you're opposing, like in the civil rights movement, the reaction to the march in Selma, the people being beat up for sitting at lunch counters, Rosa Parks, so. What are the kinds of things that can be done today, besides just protests?
Well, I mean, I think we saw it in the wake of the Laquan McDonald shooting video. That people, people marched in the streets without permits. As someone who has fought with the city of Chicago for some decades about this issue,
familiar with that,
and been in court more times than I can care to about it, that was one of the things that was most refreshing. People were just saying, look, this mayor covered for murder of a black person by his own police department so that he could win re-election. And people were saying, what's marching in the streets without a permit next to that? What's demonstrating in front of the mayor's office, the mayor's residence, which by the way is a violation of state code. I flip these things up. And people did it because people had enough. And we saw,
did change. I mean, it did create some change.
I mean, arguably, we had a change of figures at the top. We got rid of Anita Alvarez. We got rid of Gary McCarthy. And the kind of systemic change that we need is still waiting. We don't have an elected police accountability council, CPAC for short. In terms of our situation with our schools, we don't have an elected school board in Chicago, unlike the entire rest of the state.
Though I haven't served on an elected school board, we can take that as a different discussion. I have my issues with that as well.
But there is no accountability still for the Rahm Emanuel administration. And speaking in terms of the homeless issue, there are so many campaign contributions from real estate interests and their attorneys and so forth. Ed Burke has built his wealth off of this whole thing, as have any number of other aldermen.
Ed Verdoliak, who bought a city alley many years ago.
There you go. There you go. So we've got a huge problem with money influencing politics way before Citizens United. I think we clearly had a huge problem with money in the 1920s in terms of, it was, the American Congress and so forth, and, up to that point was a joke in terms of how congressmen were bought and sold and the rest of it. And it was movements that even pushed back against that. I mean, the movement in the 1930s, for example. I mean, money is a huge problem in politics, and I find it really despairing that the Democrats' idea of an answer to a millionaire governor is to run a millionaire candidate.
A different millionaire governor?
Yes.
I have my own issues with that one as well. But we're just about out of time. So in 30 seconds, what are some things that average people can do? Let's come back to homelessness in particular. What are some things that average people can do to try to work this? Now it's 25 seconds because I talked too long. So.
People have got to give these politicians hell. Don't believe their words. They will say they're doing this, that, and the other thing, and yet they can shower millions of dollars on rich people and their projects, but they're not building public housing. We need to rebuild the public housing structure in this country, and that's only going to happen if people force that kind of change. That's what happened in the 30s. That's what happened in the 1960s. That's what we need to do again today.
Andy, thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you, Kevin.
And we'll get you back again sometime soon.
Thank you.
So thank you for watching once again on Public Perspective. Our guest has been Andy Thayer, all-round activist and longtime Chicago hero. I'm Kevin McDermott. You've been watching Public Perspective. We're on Comcast Channel 19 every Saturday night at 8. And you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.